Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you very much for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here, and it's an honor to contribute to this very prominent lecture series. As mentioned, I am about to finish a biography about one of Gerhard Fischer's predecessors within the field of heritage preservation in Norway. So tonight I would like to introduce you to this man and his stances on the ideological ground underlying the safeguarding of cultural heritage. Thus my talk will thus address questions of theories and ideas surrounding the medieval and post-medieval monuments in Norway rather than the specific monuments themselves. Central to the cultural debate of the early to mid-20th century was the issue of nation building and national identity. These issues are, I believe, of fundamental importance to understand the work of Gerhard Fischer and probably also Ian Gordon Lindsay, the two men whose name this lecture series commemorates. So, let's start here, in this little town called Lysekil, situated on the western coast of Sweden, some 50 miles from the Norwegian border. At the beginning of the 20th century, Lysekil was a fashionable spa town for the Swedish urban bourgeoisie. One sunny afternoon in the summer of 1902, a good-looking man in his mid-20s came riding on a bike into this little town. His bike was loaded with photo equipment, and he gained a certain attention not only from the local fishermen, but also from the visiting clientele taking sea baths and sun for their health. As neither bicycle nor photo camera had yet become familiar items to the general public, the young gentleman in his sporting outfit appeared stunningly modern. And his name was Harry Fett. He came from Norway, where he was regarded a promising young man. Recently educated as an art historian at German universities, he was now working for the Society of the Preservation of Ancient Norwegian Monuments, Fortidsminneforeningen, and he also held a position as keeper of antiquities at the Norwegian Folk Museum in Oslo. Fett had made himself noticed at home with his critical views on architectural restoration, advocating the very modern perspective that historical buildings ought to be conserved rather than restored. His errand in Sweden during the summer of 1902 was a scholarly one. He trailed the county of Bohuslän to visit historical buildings, especially medieval churches, and to document them with his brand new camera. His stop at Lysekil was a few days' break of swimming and sunbathing. On the smooth rock slopes beside the bathhouses, Harry Fett met a fellow art historian just the same age as himself. This was Sigurd Kurman from Stockholm, son of the chief physician at the Lysekil spa. I don't know whether Sigurd Kurman is among the people on this photograph, but it is taken by his father, and I have had real trouble finding any photographs of the young Sigurd Kurman. But the situation is probably very much similar to what to the setting of Kurman and Fett's first meeting. And Harry found that Sigurd shared his enthusiasm for swimming, biking, and medieval churches, that he was familiar with the writings of John Ruskin and Alois Riegel, and that he held the same views in restoration questions as he did himself. Young Kurman spent the summer at his familiar spectacular Lysekil villas, which, due to his father's passion for everything Norwegian, these villas, summer villas, were built in a traditional Norwegian rustic style. Dr. Kurman was an ardent Scandinavist and had raised his children to appreciate Norwegian culture as much as Swedish. Harry Fett was half Swedish himself and thus familiar with Sweden's history and literature. Both he and Kurman considered themselves Scandinavian rather than Norwegians or Swedes, and this was a blending that also characterized the landscape surrounding them. As a former Norwegian territory, Bohuslän was marked by the cultural hybridity characteristic of most borderlands. So Fett's encounter with Kurman in the summer of 1902 initiated a lifelong personal and professional friendship. The two of them came to share the same professional title. During the following decades, they became national antiquarians in Norway and Sweden, respectively, and both held this position through several decades. Thus, Fett and Kurman were to play the leading roles in the development of professional cultural heritage management in Scandinavia. On more than one level, the meeting of these two future national antiquarians is emblematic. The situation comprises elements that came to determine the coming professional life of both. Regarding Harry Fett, three aspects of his coming work as scholar, antiquarian, and advocate of heritage preservation were already recognizable at Lysekil in 1902. First, his competent attitude to systematic inventory and documentation with the help of modern technology. Second, his gift for establishing friendship with professionals across national borders. And third, his complex stance to the issue of national culture. Taking this emblematic situation at Lysekil as a point of departure, I would like to shed light on Harry Fett's ideological approach to historical preservation. And the question of nationalism and national culture is the crux of the matter. Throughout the first half of the 20th century, preservation of cultural heritage in Norway was very much a process of nation building for a young nation with a newly won independence. The country's cultural heritage was loaded with a large symbolic potential ready at hand for ideological application. But in several cases, Harry Fett's understanding of this symbolic potential came to differ from that of other leading intellectuals in Norway. Through his numerous books and articles, most of which were free ponderings on cultural and political issues rather than strictly academic discourses, Fett eventually became a controversial figure with many opponents. His career coincides with a period in which national identity was consolidated and the foundation for the modern social democracy were laid in Norway. And ironically, the leading figure of heritage preservation was often on a collision course with the dominating ideological currents in these processes. When Fett met Kurman in 1902, Norway and Sweden were in the last phase of their century-long history as a united kingdom under the Swedish crown. The union between the two nations were initiated back in 1814, when Norway became independent from 4 centuries of Danish rule and got its radically democratic constitution. And if you look very close, the Norwegian constitution is sort of, I don't know if you can see it, but it's depicted. The document is depicted behind the Norwegian flag, so this was sort of one of the important foundations also for this United Kingdom. And since then, the Norwegians had had their own national assembly, elected by popular vote, but still their sovereign was the Swedish king, and the two nations had a shared foreign policy in which Sweden was the dominant part. Whereas the ideas of Scandinavism, expressed in this poster from the middle of the 19th century, this fraternization of the three Scandinavian nations, these ideas enjoyed great popularity among the Swedish during the 19th century. However, the Norwegian were never too passionate about it. From the very beginning, leading Norwegian intellectuals were skeptical towards the union with Sweden, and discontent increased during the last decades of the 19th century, along with growing nationalism. In 1905, the union was dissolved after a coup d'etat by the Norwegian government against the Swedish king. However peacefully the dissolution turned out, the danger of war between Norway and Sweden was real enough late in 1904 and through most of 1905. The tense political situation made people in both countries feel anxious and even aggressive, especially in border areas like Bohuslän, where Harry Fett 2 years earlier had enjoyed friendly cross-national fraternization. Norway enthusiasts and Scandinavists like Sigurd Kurman and his parents were deeply disappointed and considered the union secession as a betrayal on the part of the Norwegians. As nationalism grew on both sides of the border, blurred concepts of national culture, like the one upheld in the Kurman villas at Lysekil, became altogether harder to promote. Still, Harry Fett never adopted the idea of separate national cultures. He was clearly a patriot, but he nevertheless agitated for another story about Norway's way to freedom than the one that was prevalent during the age of his professional career. And at this point, I think a little background information might be helpful, as I don't expect you to know the Norwegian modern history by heart, so to speak. The prevailing narrative of the Norwegian history follows the three-stage pattern of a classical myth. First, the Golden Age, long past Golden Age, the Viking and medieval period when Norway was an independent and expansive kingdom, reaching almost to where we are now, followed by the Dark Ages and suppression under foreign rule when Norway became a dependency under Denmark from about the Protestant Reformation, illustrated here by the crumbling and decaying facade of the Nidaros Cathedral, which became a kind of an emblem for these Dark Ages, and eventually a new awakening, liberation and independence with the Constitution of 1814. So this was sort of the general narrative. And the topos of liberation from foreign suppression became what we could call a narrative template, a pattern of remembering which more or less consciously shaped the collective memories of the Norwegians. And other subsequent events were very easily fitted into this template. The dissolution of the Swedish-Norwegian Union in 1905 fitted easily into this template, as did Norway's liberation for German occupation in 1945. Hence, in Norwegian collective memory, the line of numbers 1814, 1905 and 1945 has become a formula for Norway's history of increasing national freedom. In the 19th century, Norwegian nationalism was characteristic of nationalist movements in dependent areas. It embraced a doctrine of radicalism, opposition, and liberation. After 1905, when the national fight for autonomy had come to a successful end, this radical national outlook came to be a triumphant ideology and continued to be the mainstream intellectual current in Norwegian debate. Although it's withering, its impact is still felt today and may have contributed to Norway's persistent resistance to becoming a member of the European community, the European Union. Crucial to this template of national liberation was the idea that an authentic Norwegian mind or national character had developed during the Middle Ages and kept itself alive, although sleeping, during the centuries of foreign oppression. This national character featured masculine qualities like bravery and stamina, strengthened through the hardship of a fierce natural environment and an inhospitable climate. The polar explorer Fridtjof Nansen came to incarnate this idea of Norwegian character in this time. But for this national character to prosper, however, freedom and independence were necessary conditions. Within this mindset, the peasant, unspoiled by foreign urban decadence, became a key figure. Since medieval times, Norwegian farmers have held their own land and were, unlike most European peasants, independent of feudal lords. Thus, the intellectual elites of 19th and early 20th century Norway had a fancy for traditional rustic lore and culture, which they interpreted as expressions of an authentic national character, strong enough to survive suppression and foreign domination. At an early stage of his career, Harry Fett made his living from two institutions that owed their very existence to this idea. As I mentioned earlier, the Society for the Preservation of Ancient Norwegian Monuments and the Norwegian Folk Museum in Oslo. So he was sort of making his living from this very idea of the national character. Still, there are strong indications that his narrative template underlying the understanding of Norwegian history was an other. Although Harry Fett certainly appreciated great artworks like this painting and also promoted national culture in modern art, he interpreted the Norwegian history differently. Instead of a drama in 3 acts of glory, lost and reconquered, Fett conceived of Norwegian history as a narrative of continuity and communication. He did not subscribe to the idea of an uncorrupted Norwegian culture surviving in rustic isolation, pure and free from degenerating foreign influence. To him, foreign influence was what Norwegian history was all about. He saw all cultural expressions as results of human intercourse, either across national borders or across generations. What determined the form and character of any cultural achievement was the constellation of time, place, resources, and creative minds involved. To Harry Fett, the history of Norway, as the history of any nation, was about exchange, travel and trade, towns and villages, arts and crafts, production and cultivation of the country's resources. Furthermore, it was about the growth of civilizing international phenomena like church, schools, law courts and armed forces, and it was about the great minds of artists, statesmen and businessmen, all standing on the shoulders of their predecessors. The underlying template of his outlook was the story of a universal human will to build societies and create art and institutions, occasionally set back by revolutions and other destructive breaks with the continuous bonds between past and present. Given this narrative template, it was impossible for Fett to regard the 400 years period of Danish rule in Norway as a dark age. Contrary to most of his contemporaries, he provocatively praised the 17th and 18th centuries of absolute monarchy for its political and military art, its classical educational ideals, its literature, and not least, its architecture. I have chosen this example of late 17th century mansion in Oslo because it's built by a Scotsman. So, and this was also illustrated. This also illustrates Harry Fett's point, because he never ceased to emphasize the country's debt to the Danish officials and civil servants who served in Norway during this period. Neither did he neglect the impact of the Dutch, German, English, and Scottish tradesmen who founded enterprises and added values to the country, both economically and culturally, from the 15th to the 18th centuries. In Harry Fett's eyes, the physical remnants of the activities of these men, like classicizing countryside manors, town mansions, fortresses, and wharves along the coast, all these remnants of all these historical monuments were equally important to preserve as the sort of national, ingenious Viking ships, stave churches, and peasant farms buildings, which was sort of the canonized Norwegian culture. Contrary to his opponents, who were inspired by romanticists like Herder and held the view that nationhood was a question of ethnicity and language, Fett's concept of nationhood emphasized civic effort and contribution to the common good. He said, "A man's fatherland is where he gets the opportunity to accomplish the achievement of his prime or the entire work of his life." And yeah, this is a claim he does in a long essay about the international class of military officials who served in Norway during the 17th century. So his concept of nationhood is really fundamentally different from that Herderian romanticist view shared by most of his contemporaries. And Harry Fett's alternative view on nationhood and nationalism, and his dislike for revolutionary continuity-breaking ideas, made him take a conservative stand in the Norwegian political landscape. He insisted on historical continuity, where his radical national opponents saw breaches. He insisted on national building processes, where they saw oppression, and he saw cultivation of a classical heritage, where they saw foreign, imported, unnational, and thus untrue cultural expressions. And the opposition between classical and national is significant here. Originating in the ideas of Romanticism, the variants of nationalism in Norway came to have one common determinator: they were all clearly anti-classical. Classical culture came to be associated with constraint, awkwardness, and artificiality, whereas Norwegian national culture was authentic, natural, and free. The distaste for classicism showed itself in art, literature, architectural style, and educational ideas. Fett came to belong to the opposite camp a small urban elite of conservatives defending cosmopolitanism and holding the common European classical heritage in high esteem. In the first half of the 20th century, national and radical currents were so dominant in Norway that this position, which in other countries may be considered as very reactionary, appeared almost as countercultural. Harry Fett was not the only exponent of this view, but his voice was among the loudest in the public debate. To a certain extent, Harry Fett's view on nationhood must have been determined by his foreign extraction. Not only was his father Swedish, his father was also a foreigner, an industrial entrepreneur from Hamburg, who settled in Norway as a young man and came to regard the country as his homeland. Thus, the statement I quoted earlier about the fatherland being where a man has accomplished his life's work can easily be read as a description of Fett's German father. But an equally important factor may be Harry Fett's academic training as an art historian during the heyday of style analysis. The systematic comparative study of artistic styles developed at German University in the 1890s aimed to integrate psychological, empirical, and visual factors in a methodological framework. This opened the way for new and more complex understanding of the rise, diffusion, and development of cultural expressions across periods and national territories. And Harry Fett was introduced to this new approach directly from its sources. He studied in Strasbourg with Wilhelm Føge, the father of modern stylistic analysis for medieval art. Yeah, that's the gentleman to the left. I'm sorry, the labels have fallen out. And later, when he studied in Berlin, he followed lectures by this other gentleman, the rising academic star Heinrich Wölfflin. When he returned to Norway around 1900 to initiate his career as an antiquarian, he had an academic background that nobody else in the country possessed. As the first Norwegian scholar, he traced the influence of European art and architecture on the Norwegian heritage systematically and with methodological precision. In his research on medieval sculpture and painting in Norway, he made a groundbreaking effort to show the intimate connections with English and French art at the same time. In numerous pioneering studies on Norwegian folk art and rural architecture, he recognized variants of the great European styles, Renaissance, Baroque, Rococo, Empire, fortunately or unfortunately reshaped to a local flavor by the skills and creativity of the individual craftsmen. In the ideological climate of this time, and this is perhaps hard to understand today, but in the ideological climate of his time, dominated by nationalism, this tracing of classical forms and European styles in Norwegian folk art has had considerably provocative potential, and people were also provoked. Fett's insistence on continuity through time and space was in perfect harmony with his stand in antiquarian issues. He clearly disapproved of 19th century historicism and illusionist restorations à la Viollet-le-Duc, which he scornfully labeled as masquerade, theatre, romantics, and utopia. And these are some examples of that from restoration of monuments in Norway. Notwithstanding the fact that historical reconstructions might be based on minute archaeological investigations and historical surveys, they were doomed to be what he called inadequately applied scholarship in the place of true respect. Adopting the slogan of another of his Strasbourg professors, Gerhard Fischer, who claimed conservation, not restoration, Harry Fett defended the view that the marks of shifting times should not be erased from historical buildings or objects. Quite on the contrary, a building showing signs of changes and usage was a testimony to the reality of continuity. Obviously, in great depth to Gerhard Fischer, Fett found yet another theoretical foundation for this attitude in the Austrian art historian Alois Riegel, who developed his landmark theory of preservation just when Harry Fett first entered the scene of heritage management in Norway. Fett explicitly adopted Riegel's concept of multiple memory values, Erinnerungswerte, from his celebrated 1903 paper, Der moderne Denkmalkultus, which I suppose is very familiar to this audience. According to Riegel, a monument is worth preserving according to its use value, Gebrauchswert, its historical value, historisches Wert, its art value, Kunstwert, and its age value, Alterswert. I apologize for I suppose you all is very familiar with this, but it's important to understand Fett's ideas. A building or an object possesses historical value in so much as it is a source of knowledge about that time in which it originated. Independently of its historical value, the formal design of the object constitutes its art value. The historical value links the monument to the age in which it was made, whereas the art value links the monument to the age of its commentators or its beholders. While the historical value is definite, the art value is relative, changing with shifts of taste and aesthetic preferences. In addition to these, Riegel coined the famous concept of age value, Alterswert, which depend neither on factors in the epoch in which the monument was created, nor in our time, but on the continuum of time that connects us with the individuals who once had the object made, who used it, altered it, neglected it, and recovered it. The age value shows itself in the worn surface of the object and in the collage-like patchwork of additions and alterations made throughout history, making each historical object unique and irreplaceable. To Harry Fett, Riegel's idea of age value became a conceptual tool especially suited to support his conservative message about historical continuity. As an antiquarian, he accordingly regarded the age value of any monument the most precious of the Riegelian values. To illustrate the task of balancing the contrasting and often conflicting interests of preservation, Fett applies the metaphor of a horse-drawn chariot, saying managing heritage preservation is like driving a chariot drawn by 4 horses. From time to time, the age value horse trots at another pace to the horse of historical value, while the powerful horses of art value and use value may occasionally confuse the steering. But the age value horse needs the tightest rein, and the other horses are to follow this pace. Fett persistently stands up for this view from his very first pamphlet on antiquarian issues, published in his early 20s, to his memoirs as an old man. Faced with the realities of practical preservation during his office as a national antiquarian, he is, however, not always totally faithful to this creed. When it comes to specific cases, he often takes a more pragmatic stand to the issue of conserving instead of restoring. Furthermore, his defense of age value appears to be selective. Over and again, he finds the traces of historicism of the late 19th century less worth preserving than the traces of other historical epochs. Nevertheless, the Hegelian concept of age value was seminal not only to Fett's antiquarian practice, but also to his writings on cultural history and cultural politics. In a remodeled and extended version, the concept of age value constantly pops up in Harry Fett's literary works. In Riegel, what constitutes the age value of an object is the beholder's experience of its historicity. As such, Riegel's age value is a soft, non-quantifiable quality possessed by objects and buildings of the past. Although Harry Fett adopts this idea and emphasizes the sensual experience of age value as vital, he also introduced a dimension from another and harder field than Riegel's academic sphere, that of economics. There is a striking frequency of economic modes of expressions in Fett's books and articles. Phrases like age value are likely to increase, or the cultural reservoirs of Europe, and even the Baroque view of art was booming, are but a few examples from his language. It might be his mercantile family background that generated such wordings, but Fett was indeed himself also a business executive. Throughout his career, he shared his time between the office as National Antiquarian and the position as manager of the industrial enterprises he inherited from his father. This double professional identity made him perhaps more familiar with practical life than the average academic. Hence, one may ask to what extent Fett economic phrases should be read metaphorically only. A closer reading of his texts show that his usage of the word value implies a specific material content that is unusual for the context of cultural heritage. Obviously, Fett does not speak of marketable values. Still, his usage reveals a conception of age value that is not merely intellectual and emotional, but refers to something manifest and solid, comparable with financial values in the nation's economy. Cultural and financial values are different currencies, constituting the basic resources of any society, and should be administrated, cultivated, and increased equally. As both are rooted in evident realities, neither can be invented. According to Fett, the speculative values of national romantic dreamers who made inventive restorations or reconstruction of historical buildings, and the financial gamblers of the 1920s are equally unsound, unsustainable, and bound to collapse. Despite his juxtaposition of cultural and financial assets, Harry Fett was definitely not a materialist. The office of National Antiquarian imposed upon him a specific responsibility to preserve material heritage and fight for the monument's age value. However, he never found monument worth preserving for their own material sake. An antiquarian preserving bare antiquities is a poor antiquarian, he once proclaimed. We antiquarians should be sympathetic towards all kinds of human age value. Our activity is indeed hard to defend without a deep rooting in the humanities. His position is that of classical humanism. In the end, the preservation of any monument from the past is only justified to the extent that it also preserves moral and spiritual values. Are you tired? I'm on the last leg. of this journey through Harry Fett's thinking. According to his liking of the tangible language of economics, Harry Fett coined the concept cultural capital, kulturkapital, antedating Pierre Bourdieu's version of the same concept by half a century. Fett's conception of the term is, however, not a sociological category describing the habitus of individuals. Rather, it concerns the community as a whole. To Fett, cultural capital is the stock of texts and artifacts that a society has generated throughout its history, a reservoir of cultural values whose preservation and increase is a collective responsibility. This concept corresponds largely to what modern theorists label cultural memory. According to the German cultural analysts Jan and Aleida Assmann, cultural memory comprises the way a society ensures cultural continuity by preserving, with the help of cultural mnemonics like texts, images, libraries, museums, etc., its collective knowledge from one generation to the next, rendering it possible for later generations to reconstruct their cultural identity. Aleida Assmann distinguishes between two categories of cultural memory, the canon and the archive. The canon is the set of texts, works of art, objects, buildings, and historical events that constitute the cultural backbone of any society. Being the normative and formative source of any society's collective identity, items from the canons are constantly communicated, interpreted, and referred to. Regarding Norway, typical canonical items would be the ones you see here, the Constitution of 1914, the Cathedral at Nidaros, and the plays of Henrik Ibsen. The archive, on the other hand, is a deposit of knowledge, documents, and artifacts that lack actual use and relevance, and thus is hidden from the public sphere, so to speak. While the canon makes the past present and actual, the archive preserves the past as past. However, the archive contains a potential for actualization. When the canon tends to stagnate or become instrumental, mythic, or chauvinistic, the archive provides a critical corrective and invites the rediscovery of alternative discourses. As an author as well as an antiquarian, Harry Fett aimed at expanding the canon by profiting from the archive. He regarded the Norwegian canon as larger and more wide-ranging than most of his contemporaries did. Thus, he repeatedly promoted periods, works of arts, persons, which were neglected and evaluated in the mainstream national narrative in order to raise their formative potential. His books on the detested 17th and 18th centuries under Danish rule are explicit examples of this, as are his campaign for safeguarding the Hanseatic wharf called Bryggen in Bergen and the mining town of Røros in eastern Norway. So his contribution was, in fact, to bring these items out of the archives and include it in the canon. The Bergen Wharf is, with its row of storehouses from 15th to 18th centuries, as well as Røros, with its royal copper works founded in the 17th, both testified to foreign initiatives and in late medieval and early modern Norway. Hence, neither could claim any canonical status in the dominating national narrative of the early 20th century. Today, however, thanks to, I have to say, very much thanks to Harry Fett's efforts, both these sites are on UNESCO's World Heritage List. In Lysekil back in 1902, at the very start of his career, Harry Fett appeared a very modern man with his photo camera and up-to-date attitudes towards heritage preservation. This year, the centenary of his appointment as National Antiquarian in 1913, Harry Fett has himself become a cultural monument. The question is whether he belongs to the canon or to the archive. And the answer to that question is very ambiguous. In cases like Bryggen and Røros, Harry Fett came to prove that he was a man of the future. Furthermore, his efforts to establish a modern professional heritage management in Norway represent a contribution that can hardly be overrated. Still, his name is largely forgotten in Norway today. The main reason for this may be Fett's motivation for preserving the monuments. For despite the fact that heritage preservation developed into something like an activist grassroots movement during the 1970s, it was barely motivated by zealous defense of classical moral values. But already in the 1920s and 30s, Harry Fett suffered defeats. He fought for his view on age values and cultural capital on two fronts, against the ardent fundamental nationalists on the one hand, and against cultural radicalism and dawning communism on the other. He eloquently opposed both. Nevertheless, his classical humanism and orientation towards the common European heritage represented a marginal position in the Norwegian public sphere, and it still does. Fett's standpoints were controversial during his lifetime and have lost further ground after his death. Justifying preservation of material heritage by referring to moral values passed over from one generation to the next has simply been incompatible with the radical ideology that came to be the foundation of the Norwegian welfare state in the 20th century. Today, however, Norway, like the rest of the globalized world, has to face new challenges in order to preserve a sustainable community. It might be time to bring Harry Fett out from the archive, reconsider his concept of cultural capital, and aim to profit from the deposits of accumulated age values. Thank you.